The rain-slicked street pulsed with chaos, a siren's wail cutting through the dusk like a blade. Marcus Ellison, a man of quiet dignity, stood cuffed against a wall, his heart pounding not with fear, but with a fire that refused to be snuffed out. He was no stranger to this scene another night. Another baseless stop by officers who saw his skin before his humanity. But this time, the weight of their prejudice would spark a reckoning neither they nor the city would forget. Marcus, a 42-year-old attorney, had been driving home from a long day at his law firm when the flashing lights appeared in his rearview mirror. He knew the drill. Hands on the wheel, voice steady, eyes forward. Yet, officers Daniel Holt and Michael Reed didn't care about protocol. To them, Marcus was a target, a black man in a nice car who needed to be put in his place. The stop escalated quickly. Holt's barked orders, Reed's hand twitching toward his baton, and the cold steel of handcuffs snapping around Marcus's wrists. "You fit the description," Holt sneered, though no description was ever given. The crowd forming on the sidewalk murmured, phones raised, capturing the injustice unfolding under the streetlights. Marcus's mind raced, but his face remained a mask of calm. He learned long ago that anger gave men like Holt power. Instead, he memorized their faces, their badge numbers, the venom in their voices. "You're making a mistake," he said evenly, his words drowned out by Reed's mocking laugh. They shoved him into the patrol car, the door slamming with a finality that echoed through the growing crowd. The charge? Resisting arrest. A catch-all excuse for their brutality. As the car sped off, Marcus stared out the window, the city blurring past, his resolve hardening. This wasn't just about him, it was about every person who'd been profiled, harassed, or worse. At the precinct, the air was thick with the stench of stale coffee and arrogance. Holt and Reed processed Marcus with smug efficiency, tossing his wallet and keys onto a desk like trophies. "You think you're smart, huh?" Reed taunted, leaning close. Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. "Smarter than you know," he replied, his voice low but laced with steel. The officers scoffed, oblivious to the weight of their actions. They didn't know Marcus was no ordinary manha, was a rising star in the legal world, a man who'd clawed his way from a rough neighborhood to a law degree, driven by a vow to fight systemic injustice. Released on bail hours later, Marcus stepped into the pre-dawn chill, his suit wrinkled, but his purpose razor-sharp. He didn't go home. Instead, he drove to his office, a small but respected firm where he'd built a reputation for defending the voiceless. There, he began to work. He pulled records, reviewed body cam footage obtained through a contact, and pieced together a case that would turn the tables. Holt and Reed weren't just reckless, they were repeat offenders. Their personnel files littered with complaints of excessive force and racial bias. Marcus's jaw tightened as he read. This wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was a chance to expose a broken system. Weeks later, the city buzzed with the news. Officers Holt and Reed were facing trial for misconduct, thanks to Marcus's meticulous lawsuit. The evidence was damning video footage of the arrest, witness statements, and a pattern of abuse stretching back years. But the real shock came when the court assigned the judge, the Honorable Marcus Ellison. Fate had a way of turning the tables, and Marcus, now robed in black, would preside over the trial of the men who'd tried to break him. The courtroom was a pressure cooker, every seat filled, the air heavy with anticipation. Holt and Reed sat at the defense table, their confidence eroded, their eyes darting nervously to the man on the bench. Marcus's presence was commanding, his gaze steady as he called the court to order. "This case," he began, his voice resonant, "is about more than two officers. It's about accountability, about a system that has too often failed those it swore to protect." The words landed like a gavel, silencing the room. Holt's lawyer tried to argue bias, claiming Marcus's involvement in the arrest tainted his impartiality. Marcus listened, his expression unreadable, before ruling with calm authority. "My role is to uphold justice, not to settle personal scores. The evidence will speak for itself." And it did. The footage played on a courtroom screen, Marcus pinned against the wall, Holt's baton raised, Reed's sneer unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The crowd outside the courthouse grew louder, chanting for justice, their voices a reminder of the stakes. As the trial unfolded, Marcus wrestled with his own emotions. He was no saint. The memory of that night burned in his chest. Yet he knew his duty wasn't to punish, but to reveal truth. Holt took the stand, his bravado crumbling under cross-examination. "We were just doing our job," he stammered, but the lie fell flat. Reed was worse. His testimony a tangle of contradictions that left the jury stone-faced. Marcus watched, his heart torn between anger and a deeper hope that this trial could be a turning point, not just for him, but for a city grappling with its own divisions. By the trial's end, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning, guilty on multiple counts of misconduct. The courtroom erupted, some cheering, others weeping. Marcus remained still, his gavel steady as he delivered the verdict. Holt and Reed were stripped of their badges, their careers over. But for Marcus, the victory was bittersweet. He knew this was one battle in a much larger war against a system that bred men like Holt and Reed, a war he'd fight for the rest of his life. As the gavel fell, Marcus felt the weight of the moment settle over him. The courtroom cleared, but the echoes of the trial lingered in the faces of the jurors, in the whispers of the reporters, in the chants of the crowd outside. He stepped down from the bench, his robes heavy with purpose, and walked to his chambers. There, alone, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. This wasn't the end, it was a beginning. The fallout was immediate. The city's police department faced a firestorm of scrutiny, with calls for reform growing louder by the day. Marcus became a reluctant symbol, his face splashed across news feeds, his story dissected on talk shows. Some hailed him as a hero, others branded him a traitor to law and order. Hate mail arrived at his office, laced with slurs, but so did letters of gratitude and written notes from mothers, students, and strangers who saw in him a glimmer of hope. One letter, from a young black girl named Aisha, read simply, "Thank you for showing me I can be more." Marcus kept it on his desk, a reminder of why he fought. But the battle was far from over. Holt and Reed's conviction exposed a deeper rot officers who operated with impunity, protected by a system that valued compliance over justice. Marcus knew he couldn't stop at one trial. He began working with community leaders, organizing forums to demand transparency and accountability. He met with young activists, their passion a mirror of his own when he'd been their age, navigating a world that judged him before it knew him. Together, they pushed for body cam mandates, independent oversight, and training to root out bias. The work was grueling, the progress slow, but Marcus was relentless. At home, his wife, Lena, saw the toll it took. Late nights found her watching him pore over case files, his brow furrowed, his coffee cold. "You can't carry this alone," she'd say, her voice soft but firm. Marcus would nod, but the fire in his eyes never dimmed. Lena, a schoolteacher, understood his drive-esh seen too many students crushed by the same system. Together, they dreamed of a future where their son, Jamal, could grow up without fear of a badge. One evening, Marcus received a call from an old friend, a retired cop named Tom Bradley. Tom had been one of the few officers who'd treated Marcus with respect back in his neighborhood days. "You're shaking things up, Marcus," Tom said, his voice heavy. "But be careful. Not everyone wants change." The warning hung in the air, a reminder of the forces aligned against him. Days later, Marcus's car was vandalized, the word judge carved into the hood. He didn't flinch. Instead, he drove it to work, a badge of defiance. The city began to shift. The mayor, under pressure, announced a task force on police reform, and Marcus was asked to advise. He accepted, knowing it was a chance to shape policy from within. At the first meeting, he faced a room of skeptics, officials who saw him as a threat, cops who felt betrayed. He didn't waver. "This isn't about blame," he told them. "It's about building a system we can all trust." Some listened, others didn't. But Marcus kept pushing, his voice steady, his arguments rooted in data and lived experience. Meanwhile, Holt and Reed faded into obscurity, their names synonymous with disgrace. Marcus heard rumors Holt had moved out of state. Reed was working private security. He didn't care. His focus was on the future, on the kids like Aisha who deserved better. He started a mentorship program, guiding young people of color into law and public service. At the first session, he stood before a room of wide-eyed teens, his story raw and unfiltered. "They'll tell you who you are," he said. "Don't let them. You decide." Months later, Marcus stood at a community rally, the crowd stretching across a city park. Lena and Jamal were by his side, their presence grounding him. He spoke of justice, of resilience, of a city that could heal if it faced its truths. The crowd roared, but Marcus's eyes were on his son, who watched him with quiet pride. For Marcus, this was the real victory, not the trial, not the headlines, but the chance to show Jamal a world where one man's fight could ripple outward. As the sun set, casting gold over the park, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. The road ahead was long, fraught with resistance and setbacks. But he'd faced worse scuffs on his wrists, sneers in his face, a system stacked against him. He'd turned that night on the street into a catalyst, a spark that lit a fire. And as he looked out at the faces before him, black, white, young, old, he knew this was bigger than him. It was a movement, a demand for a future where no one's worth was judged by their skin. Marcus Ellison, the man who'd been arrested, had become the judge not just of a trial, but of a city's conscience. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.